a lot of healthy food, good meat, good fruit and veg is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people to buy, and so we're more and more reliant on ultra processed cheap food.
British farming is broken.
Farming 7 days a week for a year on a 1,000-acre farm has generated an income of £144.
Chris Smaje has a radical idea about how to fix this problem and transform our entire food supply.
We've got to transition out of fossil fuels, and that has enormous knock-on implications, but it's kind of easier to blame the food system than to look at all the other areas of our sort of day-to-day modern lives.
The question is, can we replace the energy system at, the level of versatility and abundance and price that we have become accustomed to with fossil fuels? My feeling is no.
I'm here to tell you very, very quickly about how I am absolutely exploding my growth on YouTube. This tool is called Cast Magic. So, all you have to do is input your link to Cast Magic. It will give you a transcript of your entire podcast or YouTube show. It will give you all of the AI content you could ever imagine, including introductions, speaker bios, keywords, titles, timestamps, threads, promotional tweets, blog posts, and much, much more. You even get Magic Chat where people can treat your podcast like ChatGPT and ask questions about it. There's so much more. Cast Magic and use code CASTING30 to get 30% off. Okay? Thank you. I hope that was fast. Enjoy the podcast. So, hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined by Chris Smaje, the author of A Small Farm Future, Making the Case for a Society Built Around Local Economies, Self-Provisioning, Agricultural Diversity and the Shared Earth, and more recently Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, the Case for an Ecological Food System and Against Manufactured Foods, and also the proud owner of a small farm in Somerset. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, not a problem. I came across some of your work on Twitter. Haven't seen some clips of interviews and then went away and watched them. And then you very kindly sent me a copy of the book, and I've been really enjoying that. So thanks for joining me. It's farming something that I think people are thinking a lot more about recently. And I would put quite a lot of that down to Clarkson's farm being just so wildly popular, I really started to think about farming myself 3-4 years ago as a much bigger issue that we need to think about. But after reading Setopia by Carolyn, that's Steele, that's it. And had her on the show, and since then it's really dawned on me how much debate there is within the world as to how we should produce our food. And so maybe a good place to start would be to get you to lay out what you see as the problems with the way we currently organize our food system and supply chains and manufacture our food in this country.
Right. Well, that is a big topic. But I mean, you're right. It's sort of interesting how, people haven't really thought much about food generally, despite the fact that it's almost like we forget that we're all animals. We all need to eat every day, and yet we sort of take for granted there's this kind of massive global food system that sort of somehow gets food to our doors. It's something that we, that we need to think about, and particularly, I think, the interesting thing about farming, everything is complex and relates to everything else in complex ways. But the thing about farming is that it's really that intersection of human society and all of our structures, politics, economics, and so on, with nature and ecology, sort of how we fit into the larger planetary systems. And what we know now is that we're not fitting that well into major planetary systems. Climate change, energy futures, biodiversity loss, these are all kind of really critical issues, and they're really driven, I think, by we know now that they're driven by human actions, and farming sort of looms large in that. And from a farming point of view, it's kind of driven by this by a fossil energy system that kind of drives overproduction of essentially arable grains, which we either eat ourselves directly or feed to livestock or use for biofuels. We've got this system of essentially using fossil energy to crank out way too many arable grains at far too cheap a price, really. And if I was to sort of try and home in on one problem in the sort of global food system, it's this globalization of the sort of fossil fuel enhanced production of cheap arable grains. So really my whole thing is to argue for a relocalization of more diverse foods. That is probably going to mean the need for more people to be working in one way or another within agriculture or farming, food production, at all sorts of different levels. And that, I think, ultimately is going to be better for people, better for Earth systems in terms of issues like climate change, better for nature. So, but it's a big, it kind of involves unstitching the whole sort of drift of the sort of the global economy, global politics, urbanization, the sort of movement of labor out of farming. So it's big stuff that we're talking about here.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, it's a massive issue, and I think it's honestly, it's really weird to me watching the lack of discussion that our food supply gets, like in times like the general election. I was amazed at the lack of words in manifestos about farming, like especially given the massive upheaval in the funding system sort of post-Brexit, now that like all the subsidies have started to disappear, and yet there's really not like a massive amount of discussion about, okay, well, how are we going to change our food supply system and fund farming and change farming in a way that makes it like economically and environmentally sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know to the extent to which Britain is unusual in this respect. We have become accustomed, we kind of urbanized and industrialized very early, and we have long been a country, we're a rich country that has long been accustomed to importing, the food that we need. And, there's this whole, the sort of mainstream economic narrative is essentially that trade is good, comparative advantage, you can, best leave production of whatever, to the people that can produce it best and cheapest, and that's kind of the way that global farming policy has gone, that we globally we've become more and more reliant on a small number of breadbasket regions, and more or less every part of the world has specialized agriculturally in just producing the one or the handful of crops that it can sort of sell most advantageously into global markets. But I think that era of global history is coming to an end, and I agree with you that it's disappointing in the election so little discussion of food and farming. I mean, obviously there's not very many farmers in the UK. They're not a kind of important political constituency, and that's part of the problem. But yeah, you only have to look at issues around climate change, energy futures, things like the war in Ukraine that sort of have led to sort of big global food shocks. It's a very it's a high risk strategy to rely on sort of being able to buy food on global markets. The first thing that countries tend to do when they get into trouble is kind of shore up their own food security, their own energy security. and that potentially leaves us exposed. And people often say, "Oh, Britain, it's a small, very densely populated country. We can't produce all of our food," but we pretty much can. I mean, we do produce most of our grain and a lot of meat. We don't produce nearly enough of our fruit and veg. I mean, I would say that as a veg grower, but it's true, But the reasons for that are not really because of the lack of space or ability to grow these things. It's kind of political decisions and ultimately the price of labor relative to the price of energy. But these things are going to change in the world going forward, and we really need to be alive to that.
It's really interesting you mentioned the amount of food that we could produce ourselves here, because now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I may have got the figures like slightly wrong. I spoke to Liz Webster, who's like a big sort of pro farming, or actually she's a farmer herself, but pro farming advocate. She's like done a lot of campaigning about why Brexit's been bad for farmers. She was saying that sometime in the sort of 70s, 80s, we were producing like 95% of our food supply, and now it's down to I think about 60%. So is one of the questions I really always have is how much of our food supply could we realistically produce in this country, and we can go back to the overproduction sort of problem after this, but how much is it like sensible in a sense to import? Like surely there's countries with large areas of land that are going to farm. Is there like a case to have some of the stuff imported and grown abroad, or like meat made abroad, although that seems silly given that we have lovely pastures to graze animals on. But yeah, so how much of our food can we realistically make in this country?
Well, obviously, we're going to struggle to produce the sort of coffee and bananas and things like that people have become accustomed to. But we can produce. I mean, I've done various sort of kind of glorified back of the envelope calculations in both of my books, and I'm pretty sure that we can produce pretty much all the food that we need. We do have to think about climate change and looking after soils and so on. And but it's a matter of kind of taking an interest in it and making it a priority. But as you say, there are countries that can crank out agricultural commodities and cheap grain in particular. But that's where I think we need to be careful that a lot of those places they don't owe us anything. I think we're sort of moving into a kind of global geopolitical situation that you can see very clearly with the EU, North America, China, Russia. We're moving into some sort of turbulent times geopolitically. So both with food and probably even more so with energy, and sort of food production and energy production are very closely related. We have to be careful about assuming that other people are going to be producing stuff for us, and obviously that has knock-on effects in terms of access to food for other people, global poverty, and so on. So yeah, we can produce most of our food. The real thing is the sort of fruit and the veg. I mean, the way this manifests is that basically fossil energy is cheap, whereas human labor, in a rich country like Britain, is dear. I mean, it kind of is the other way around in poorer countries, and that's kind of the global division of labor. So things like fruit and veg production is labor intensive, or I've taken to using the word job rich, because we have this we have this kind of funny view of farming. When we talk about creating jobs, if you talk about most sectors of the economy, new jobs have been created. People are like, oh, great, new jobs. Whereas the whole narrative in farming is that it's good to get jobs out of farming. But, we've done too much of that, and that's partly why we're not food self-reliant or secure in the UK. We need more people working in farming, and particularly in those job-intensive horticulture sectors, which, and basically that's the kind of food we should be eating. It's healthy for us, diverse, Whole Foods, fresh fruit and veg, it's easy for, the North American prairies to kind of crank out endless grain, which is good for us in moderation, but we eat too much of that in our diet. And bear in mind also climate change. A lot of the real breadbasket parts of the world are kind of continental, semi-arid areas, which are really at risk of climate change and water scarcity. So kind of saying, those other guys can produce this stuff for us more cheaply, that's not a good long-term bet. So I think, everywhere we need to be kind of reining in the production, sort of relocalizing it, thinking about its kind of ecological footprint, and thinking about what producing for our needs, not necessarily for our wants, but what kind of diverse diets we can produce locally that feeds everybody well.
Yeah, and so that touches on this overproduction thing that you mentioned earlier, because there are parts of the world that have, like you said, like massive expanses of land, and they just sort of like crank out grains. And one of the things you mentioned in the interview I talked about with Joe Politics with Ollie, that was, you talked about how a lot of the forces of globalization have pushed certain nations to become specialists at like a handful of crops, and then sort of globally we've become specialists again, like a handful of crops. I think it's like 8 to 10 crops that we produce globally, just like on a monstrous scale.
Yeah.
Why does that drive overproduction? And how bad is the problem? Like how much extra stuff are we making that we don't need?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, because depends on how we define need and so on. But I think one of the key issues is feeding arable grains to livestock. I mean, there's a whole sort of very polarized debate around livestock, but the main increase in meat consumption globally is in pigs and chickens, which are fed on arable grains, basically. The whole issue of ruminants, the cattle and sheep and so on, in my opinion, gets a little bit too much airtime. And the real increase is pigs and chickens, because they're fed grains, and that's one of the main sources of overproduction. So I mean, we've got this kind of global economic system that rewards basically sort of profit maximization or net present value. So it's all about cutting input costs and maximizing profits, and that and sort of governments obviously try and make some amends in terms of the impacts of that on people and on nature. But in as much as that kind of global free market profit motive driven system drives the economy, that's what you get. You get people producing as whatever they can sell, advantageously wherever they can sell it. And I suppose that manifests locally. A wonderful book published recently by a guy called Carwyn Graves, Tyr, the story of the Welsh landscape, and he shows very nicely in his book that here in the UK, one of the major arguments about overproduction is about sheep in the uplands, and too many sheep in Wales being bad for the environment and so on. And I mean, he basically shows how there was a wonderfully diverse local agriculture in Wales historically, lots of fruit production, vegetables, cattle more than sheep, that were well integrated into the sort of local upland ecology. And that is kind of blown away by that, essentially by government policies supporting that kind of global marketization. So when you kind of, if you ask, can Wales feed itself well, the answer is yes. But if the question is, what can Wales produce most advantageously into the global agricultural commodity markets, the answer is, well, probably sheep. And that's what drives the overproduction of sheep, so that's the problem. It's kind of overproduction of commodity crops for a global market, rather than producing what people need to eat locally. What a kind of healthy, diverse local diet. And every part of the world essentially has a historic agriculture which is well keyed to a sort of low energy input agriculture, which is well keyed to a local the local ecology, whatever it happens to be, and that can produce diverse food. As you say, we've moved away from that and sort of moved towards this small number of these kind of giant global commodity crops, wheat, soy, maize, canola, rapeseed, as we call it here, those kind of crops, which certainly have their place. But you can have too much of a good thing,
Yeah. I guess, I mean, part of it's probably also because post World War II up till basically now, it was about massive, like it was about volume in order to feed like a massively growing global population. Whereas now we're not at peak population probably, but like most like global estimates reckon, I think the UN thinks it'll top out at like 8 to 9 billion. So we're like rapidly approaching like what is like peak, or like what humanity will hit as a like peak population globally. And therefore we're maybe in a moment where we need to stop thinking about just volume and start thinking about the system that's actually producing the food.
Yeah, and likewise relating that to economic growth, we had the sort of the privations of World War II that led to a sort of government emphasis on food security, and that was the time also when the whole suite of modern kind of agribusiness and agrochemicals were coming in, so more fertilizers, more pesticides, but partly it was a kind of global sort of move away from the land, and the idea that manufacturing industry generates more economic growth than you can generate from farming. So it was like, great, we've got all these technologies that can now crank out more food with less labor in agriculture, and that labor can fund economic growth in industry and manufacturing. So we had that kind of 30-year post-war period of these sort of huge economic growth, and then that's kind of had more recent manifestations, the whole story of China and so on, But as you say, we're reaching this point of peak population, but we're also reaching this point of sort of peak productivity, peak manufacturing, and all of that kind of productivity has driven a whole series of kind of earth systems problems that we're facing, around climate change, energy, water, soil loss, and so on. So now I think it's really critical for us to kind of step back from that and say, that time is coming to an end. What we need to do now is kind of retrench locally, stop thinking in terms of sort of cranking out sort of high volume, low margin food commodities, and start thinking about what does what does a good agroecology locally look like? How is that going to serve people's needs? I'm not saying that there's no role for trade or selling agricultural commodities into wider markets, but I think that kind of huge push that you mentioned post-war, we've got to move on from that and be a bit smarter about how we provide for ourselves locally.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the other weird trends that I see, and I wanted to get your perspective on this, is this sort of like demonization of farmers and farming as just being really bad for the environment and for the planet. For example, there's a lot of like very stringent regulations being put in place. There's like, it seems almost like the idea is to try and like ship our food supply away from being close to home. Like the idea seems to be really counterintuitively to me that we're trying to push our farming to like, parts of the world where it's much cheaper. But it seems like that it hasn't ever made sense to me, because like if you're trying to be, you know, more ecologically considerate in terms of like the amount of energy that goes into the food supply, surely shipping it from halfway around the world is not a good way to do it. And then it also feels like, and you've mentioned this sort of thing, as like the food and energy security issues. Like, I don't understand why we think it's a good idea to just be like, well, it's fine if all our food isn't made here, especially in like, as you've mentioned, like a tumultuous geopolitical environment that seems to be getting increasingly worse. And the Ukraine war was a great example, like, because not only do they produce like massive amounts of grains, I think they make like a third of the world's nitrogen fertilizer. And obviously, like, your case would be that we need to use less of the nitrogen fertilizer and go back to like a more sort of systems based, like, look at like, you know, how do we integrate as part of the environment instead of thinking of our food supply as something aside from the environment. But like, why do you think there is this push to like offshore our food supply?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, governments have it's one of these many areas in which they've just sort of kicked the can down the road. I mean, you know, the whole sort of, and obviously from a UK perspective, you know, the Brexit has been significant in this, but I mean, you began your question then around the demonization of farmers, and I think, you know, this is it's a big problem, really. You know, there's a kind of environmentalist narrative which is very sort of globally focused on sort of climate change and food impacts, and you know, rightly pointing to many issues, but you know how that impacts farmers locally, you know, it can manifest sort of very differently. And you know, one of the problems we've had with UK farming policy is that, you know, rightly, the government has emphasized, you know, so-called environmental services. You know, what is the impact of farming on the local environment, on biodiversity, on water, and so on. But they've sort of neglected the other side of that, which is food production. So, I mean, farmers are understandably, you know, post-war, as we were just saying, the whole narrative was get big, crank it out, produce. Then all of a sudden it's like, no, you know, you've screwed the environment. Now you need to take care of the environment. And, you know, if you think of what we're asking of farmers, we're asking them to, you know, to sort of stand on their own feet as independent businesses. We're asking them to produce food at historically unprecedentedly low prices and to take care of the environment. You know, they can't do that alone without, you know, proper sort of joined up government thinking, which isn't really happening. And so, you know, I think food production has got to be brought into that. You know, it's not just sort of paying for public goods, paying for environmental goods. Farmers have got to be paid properly for producing food. That means that food prices probably have to increase. And so that has all sorts of knock-on implications in terms of housing costs, land costs, energy, and you know, and ultimately social inequality. You know, I mean, there's sort of a narrative of let's keep food cheap, so that poor people can afford it, and we then don't really have to look at inequality. So, you know, inequality is very important in all of this. You know, we need farmers to be rewarded properly, but that means we need you know, we need to sort of think about the inequalities in society and the costs of housing and land. And that's why all these issues, you know, it sort of ends up being this whole kind of whirligig of food prices, energy prices, you know, the cost of labor, cost of housing, all kind of interconnect. So you kind of start at one point and you sort of end up somewhere totally different. But, you know, that's why we need that sort of joined up government thinking to be addressing all of that. But yeah, as you said, I think, you know, what's problematic for farmers is if you sort of say, right, you know, you need to deliver better environmental services, and we're going to pay you to do that, but we're not going to pay you for producing food. And then if you sort of make free trade deals with countries that, you know, have lower environmental standards and can produce food more cheaply, but as we were talking earlier, not necessarily more resiliently. That sends a terrible message to farmers, and it becomes unfeasible. I mean, I say this as someone who's, I'm very, very small scale, very much below the radar of all of the sort of subsidy system and sort of a lot of these issues. I mean, my model is kind of low input, low output, kind of sort of keep out of that kind of system as much as possible, and just focus on producing some local food, local veg. But I think that's the bigger picture, that and it's basically impossible for farmers. But there is a kind of blame narrative where I think ultimately what's at the root of a lot of this is fossil fuels. We've got to transition out of fossil fuels, and that has enormous knock-on implications. But it's kind of easier to blame the food system than to look at all the other areas of our sort of day-to-day modern lives, which are so deeply reliant on fossil energy. So that, I think, is one of the parts of the whole food and farming debate, which I think is a bit unfortunate, that it's kind of easy to sort of find easy scapegoats, really, rather than sort of looking at the whole systems of which we're all a part.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touch on something that I often mention when people talk about like the desire to transition away from fossil fuels, and it's something like you mentioned in a couple of things I've read and watched about, where you've sort of acknowledged that fossil fuels, like the transition away from them, will mean that we have a less abundant and somewhat sort of available energy supply and grid. It's unlikely, at least in the near term, to reach the same levels of widespread abundance, use, availability, just because it's more complicated to store energy, and we don't quite have the tech yet, or the infrastructure to have renewable energy, producing the levels of energy that we'd require to transition perfectly. Do you know what I mean? Just go straight from all oil and gas to all I don't know, wind, solar, nuclear, whatever way people think we should go with it. And I often think, why are we only talking about how much energy we need to produce? Why are we never talking about how could we use that energy more efficiently? And it's, this kind of touches on things that you're talking about in terms of the low input, low output model of farming. And I wanted to ask about ways in which farms and farmers on a small or a large scale, maybe you can talk best to the smaller scale farms, can produce food without massive amounts of energy requiring to be input. What would that look like for small farms or perhaps larger ones?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's as you say, part of this is about energy efficiency, but also using less energy. And one of the issues is that most of our ways of producing low carbon energy relate to electricity, which is great for a lot of things, but it doesn't apply so well to farming, and particularly things like fertilizer that we've become very reliant upon. That is basically uses fossil fuels, and you can produce it with electricity, but it's relatively more costly. Likewise with the sort of transport and traction that we've sort of become used to with farming. So yeah, that is an issue, and obviously people take different views about energy futures, but to me it seems wise. I don't see a kind of full energy transition occurring quickly enough to deal with the kind of climate issues we're facing. So I think it is a question of using less energy, and that's where sort of local food systems can come in. I mean, the main way that people have done this historically is through mixed farming. So essentially using sort of a rotation between grass, here in the UK, rotation between grass and cropland mediated by livestock. And I mean, this is the thing about livestock. We overproduce sort of meat and milk and so on to some extent. The real role of livestock on farms is, it's not the meat or the milk. That's a kind of bonus, albeit an important one for the diet. But the real purpose of them is as kind of ecological labourers that cycle nutrients and do the sort of ecological work on the farm. So, historically, most parts of the country would have an element of mixed farming, livestock integrated with the production of crops and woodland as well. And we've sort of, what's happened with farming is that's all been separated out as a result of cheap energy. So, you've got sort of massive grain farms in East Anglia with, no livestock in sight. Pure stock farms, more to the west of the country, the sort of forestry pushed out into sort of upland areas. And if you look at a more integrated local agriculture, you'll find woodland, cropland, grassland, livestock crops all integrated. And you can do that at a sort of lower energetic cost, but with and produce a more diverse, healthy diet, but it does require more people to be involved in it, and that obviously has not been the kind of economic structure, the narrative around farming in recent years. But as I was saying earlier, I think that's the way we need to go in the future.
It's interesting because one of the things I've listened to my mum talk about for years is like how expensive food is and how it's always getting more expensive. And, obviously that's true. Inflation, things get more expensive. But I always thought, like, when say if I go into like Tesco's later and like I want to buy like a pork shoulder or like a big roasting joint or something for dinner at the weekend. And I look at it, it's like £10 for this massive chunk of meat that's come from this cow that had to be looked after for years, probably. They've been in the barns. I always felt like food was really, really cheap, like compared to what it should be worth. And in the intro to your book, I can't remember the name of the lady who wrote it, but she wrote that book called Rooted, I believe. And she talked about a study that I was struggling to find, but maybe you can point me in the right direction at some point, was about how sometimes farmers were getting like 1% of the value of the food when it was in the supermarket. And you talk about like the cost of farming and the cost of labor to produce, especially like fruit and vegetables, things that can't be like easily picked, planted, extracted, washed, distributed, all the parts that are required for like the whole system of food production. And I wonder, it's like, is there something we could do that means that you could go to a system that would be more of the money would go to the farmers, and therefore the cost wouldn't be as prohibitive for them to make and produce like the fruits and vegetables and the more diverse types of output? Like, is there a way that we can like cut this system where supermarkets seem to make all the profit and the people actually making the food don't get like a big chunk of that? Because I feel like if there's like a big cost there somewhere that I don't know enough about how that supply chain works.
Well, there's a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's the food system is very monopolized by the big supermarkets. That is a problem in the system. I mean, it's funny how standard economic theory kind of says that a well-functioning market requires lots of producers and lots of consumers, and food can work like that. You can have lots of small local farms, lots of consumers buying it. The trouble is that it's kind of the pinch point is the big supermarkets in the middle that really dominate food retail and just drive they basically offload all the risks and costs onto the farmers who make very little. So actually breaking up that monopoly, I mean, I know it sort of sounds radical, but we kind of need radical change. That would help. But equally, the whole kind of there's just sort of such a widespread need for economic reform. Farmers are not really making much money by and large, but a lot of healthy food, good meat, good fruit and veg is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people to buy, and so we're more and more reliant on ultra processed cheap food. Like supermarkets basically are very good at taking your sort of those basic commodity crops we were talking about earlier, wheat, maize, soy and so on, and processing them into all these weird and wonderful products cheaply. They're not so great at selling good animal products, good meat, good fruit, good veg, which is sort of what we need. So yeah, I think there's a need for breaking up that monopoly to make the market work more effectively. But that then has to be part of a wider look at social inequality, and particularly the cost of housing and the cost of land, access to land. I mean, certainly, we need more small farms, more new entrants into farming, but land prices and land availability are not there, and that's to do with again another kind of economic monopoly in the kind of land and housing market. So essentially, it's and that, I guess, again, is a hot potato that governments don't really want to deal with, because it involves sort of essentially trimming the sails of wealthy people. Making land more widely available, and addressing inequality. But yeah, for sure, I think the sort of morale of farming, as far as I've sort of pick up from people I talk to and things I see, is very low. Farmers are not by and large making money, or there's I think the DEFRA figure I think I saw was something like quarter of farms in the UK have got a sort of net income of less than zero. So it's farms. Farming, actual food production sort of is almost like a kind of hobby or a side hustle for a lot of farmers. People get pushed into people talk about diversification, so people are making money doing other things. And it's kind of it's an odd way of organizing a critical industry. We don't ask sort of doctors or nurses to do a better paying job on the side. We kind of reward them, or try and reward them at a level that sort of makes them do the job that they're supposed to do sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it needs to be the same with farmers. Farmers need to be able to earn a living salary, living income from producing good food, and that kind of requires all of us to take an interest in food systems and food production, and sort of be working towards that.
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of the issues I think that has been brought to light to a lot of people, by that, like Clarkson's farm on Amazon. Like, I really have to give him a lot of credit to make. I think he's made a lot more people think a lot more about our food supply. And one of the stunning things to me was not that first series of it was when he made like £140 profit annually from his 1,000-acre farm, and like. Obviously, like, he's spending money maybe on things that he shouldn't have been, or like things that, like, his big Lamborghini tractor, or like there's obviously expenses that were like for entertainment purposes, or because he can't afford to do that. But even then, 1,000-acre farm, you're thinking there should be some profit involved in it. That's a lot of land that he's making no money from, because of the cost of, like, the ever increasing cost of fertilizer and energy inputs that are required for farming, and then the low price that as you mentioned is probably driven by the overproduction, because just like supply and demand. If there's too much of something, the price will be pushed down, even in a global market, because of the way things can be shipped around the world. But I wanted to ask you about rewilding, because that's something that like people, a lot of farmers are being paid to do. Like, what do you think of that idea? And do you think that's like a feasible way to try and sort of reduce some of the impact that like big industrial sort of like chemical heavy farming has made on the soil and the environment generally in Britain?
Well, I think, the phrase you just used, chemical heavy, is important, and when we talk about how few people are employed in farming, the reason is that sort of agrochemicals are essentially work as labor substitutes, and agrochemicals have been absolutely at the root of so much nature loss. Partly that, and partly again the sort of overproduction that we've been talking about, where farmers are just driven to sort of try and produce more and to sort of cut input costs by using often nature damaging inputs. So you sort of get into these kind of vicious circles, negative spirals. So for sure, farming, we need our farms to be more nature friendly, more diverse, use less ecocidal inputs. Again, I think that means more people in farming and higher food prices. And so then we sort of get back into that, the earlier things we were talking about. The term, the rewilding, has become a very sort of contentious idea and debate. I think the basic idea of making our farms and the wider landscape more nature friendly, conserving. Britain is an incredibly nature depleted country, sort of conserving what we've got. Not only pointing the finger at farming. I mean, farming has had a very negative impact on wildlife, but other things like hunting, sort of land use changes, urbanization, so on, are also problematic. I suppose the phrase I would use is agri-rewilding. I mean, I think it might be useful to think to sort of contrast what I'd call agri-rewilding with what people sometimes call clearance rewilding, and there is a very problematic, essentially colonial history of the idea that people sort of screw the land up, sort of are destructive of nature. So what we need to do is get people out of the landscape and sort of essentially create to a greater or lesser extent nature parks or sort of nature reserves, kind of leave the land alone. There can be a lot to be said for leaving the land alone and really sort of emphasizing wildness or wilderness. But by and large, the way I think to bring nature back is to combine it with farming, and particularly to combine it with sort of low input, low energy, kind of human-centered farming, and to sort of pay farmers appropriately for what they're doing and for the food. So yeah, I'm all in with the idea of more wildness. It's just the whole debate about rewilding has become quite polarized, sort of around this idea that we just need to stop farming, get people out of the landscape, and I have serious concerns about how that will play out, both in terms of impacts on humans, but also on nature. There's so much evidence to suggest that kind of taking small high nature value sort of farming out of the landscape really doesn't benefit wildlife in the long run. So yeah, we need to be careful how we do that.
Yeah, I guess it's just one of those forever thinks that it comes down to, people believe it's like two binary options. It's like massive industrial farms or nothing at all,
Yeah.
Whereas,
and what we have to be very careful of there is kind of developing a nice sort of non-industrialized farming in the UK, and sort of emphasizing, the sort of the kind of landscapes that we want to have. And then, as I was saying earlier, these kind of trade deals where we're just sort of essentially displacing the problem by buying in either food that's sort of industrially farmed somewhere else, or buying in energy or other inputs from elsewhere. We've got to kind of make ourselves protagonists of our landscape again, and obviously we need to produce food for ourselves, but also all the other things that we want of the landscape, and the more that we can do it locally, that's part of the sort of the arguments in my couple of books. The more that you get sort of local feedback, if you just sort of buy a food commodity in a supermarket, you've got no idea really where it's come from, what impact it's had. We need to kind of relocalize food production and make ourselves protagonists in that, so that we can become aware of the consequences of that, and sort of get those feedback loops, those informational loops going again.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think just people connecting a little bit more with the food supply would probably be fantastic. So to wrap up, what would you suggest that people can do? So say they've listened to this conversation and gone, oh, well, I'd love to try and do something about this, or, play my part, or, get involved in this a little bit. Like, what would you encourage people to go and do, or look into?
Well, probably the first thing is to take an interest in the food system. I think where we came into this discussion was that we've sort of got used to this system where food just magically appears in the shops or on our plates, and most of us don't think much about it. So start asking questions about where does this food come from, what were the conditions of its production, what impact has it had on people and on nature. And then, start trying to make your own local area, do something that makes your own local area generative of food. Now, obviously a lot of us live in cities, and we can't necessarily expect your neighborhoods to provide all of your food, but you can, even if you're living in a sort of 24 floors up on a city apartment block, you can grow some herbs on a windowsill. You can pressurize your local council to make allotments available. You can get involved in community gardening, or food activism around access to healthy food for people locally. So there's all sorts of things you can do just on a sort of basic level to start developing your interest and knowledge and support of local food systems. And I suppose bear in mind also that I tend to emphasize the need to shift from consumerism to producerism, but consumerism does have power. Basically every time you pay money to somebody, you're essentially paying them to carry on doing whatever it was they were doing. So if you're in a sort of lucky position of being able to choose, make food choices with your money, sort of learn about different food systems and start sort of using your money to pay for the kind of food that you want to see. But also, some of this is about inequality. We've talked about food prices and the unavailability of good, healthy food for a lot of people. So ultimately, we need to sort of link the whole issue of food and farming to wider issues of inequality and access to affordable housing and access to land. So, kind of get political as well, I suppose I would say, around some of those issues.
Yeah. Well, like you said, you vote with your feet. You could buy things that are, grown as locally as possible and as are,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
as unprocessed as possible. Like, it stuns me when they've got, like, obviously, like, I live in London, so like I'm around the corner from like a Tesco Express, and I went in there the other day and I looked around and I was like, 90% of this is processed crap. Like the whole, like row after row after row after row, and then there's like a corner where the fresh food is, and you're like, wow, like, isn't that the food? You know?
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, you know, supermarkets are good at processing all those commodity grain crops, but there's a real lack of good, healthy whole foods, and that's something, you know, gardening, home gardening, or allotment or community gardening, you know, but you know, there's a lot to be said for doing this sort of collectively with other people, you know, and you know, it's amazing what you can produce, even in city situations on small areas of land. You know, you're not necessarily going to, well, you're certainly not going to sort of meet all your household's food needs, but you can produce good, healthy vegetables. And if you do that with other people as kind of part of a process of getting to grips with the food system, you know, it can, you know, it can generate a lot of questions and some good local politics and you know, that's what we need to build from, really.
Well, that seems like a perfect note to end on. So, Chris, I will put the link for your website, resilience.org, in the description, along with links for your books. And
also, there's my personal website is chrissmage.com. Some of my stuff is replicated on Resilience, but yeah, chrissmage.com if you want to interact with me and look at my writings and so on.
Well, there you go. I'll put that in the description as well. Fantastic.
Right.
Yeah, thanks very much, man. This was a pleasure.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Enjoyed talking with you. Cheers.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out. And you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.